Howdy and welcome back to Gaming Bench. I am here with ASRock's Arc B580 Steel Legend, their white-themed graphics card that costs about $20 more than the base model Arc B580 from Intel and maybe some others. I think ASRock's Challenger is also supposed to cost $249, so it's $20 extra. You get triple fans, RGB lighting, two 8-pin PCI Express power connectors, which totally seem to be unnecessary. I guess they're for if you really want to push overclocking, which I haven't really tested yet. I will do that in a separate video later. I'm also going to skip talking a lot about the card and the ecosystem and all the other stuff and just get to the benchmarks on this one because I already did the unboxing. You can view that here. See the link up in the corner. Let's go ahead and talk about the card's performance. And we'll start with the high-level overview of performance. We've got 10 games that I tested. They are all rasterization games, meaning even if they support ray tracing in the game, I did not want to enable it because that usually drops performance so much, and I just don't feel like it makes a lot of sense on a $250 to $300 graphics card to look at these maxed out ray traced settings. I'm still using basically the Ultra presets at 1080p and 1440p. I've got upscaling at 1440p. But at 1080p medium, this is like kind of the bare minimum that I would recommend people use in games. I mean, you can use 1080p low, but this is a good baseline. It's maybe a little worse looking than a PlayStation 5 console, but it usually performs quite well, and Arc does perform pretty well overall, but not as well as some would like you to believe. It's a little bit slower than both the RX 7600 XT and the RTX 4060. That's because 1080p isn't really pushing the card as hard, and CPU bottlenecks and driver overhead probably plays a bigger role at 1080p medium. Even at 1080p Ultra, the 4060 still comes out in first place according to my benchmarks, and these are newer games. But it's important to keep that in mind if you play lots of new releases. If that's your intent, Arc is not going to be as good of an experience. 1440p Ultra, this is what Intel showed for the pre-launch numbers. Hey look, Arc's on top. It's about, 20% faster than a 4060? That's because I'm running into VRAM limitations on the 4060. And the 7600 isn't even anywhere close. I mean, it just dies at 1440p Ultra settings. But if we turn on upscaling at 1440p, then we're basically back to the B580 and the RTX 4060 being tied. Keep all these things in mind and let's go ahead and get through the individual gaming benchmarks. I'm just going to go through, in order of resolution and quality setting, all 10 games and briefly talk about them. Black Myth Wukong, 1080p medium, Arc B580 and Arc A770 don't do so hot. A770 is probably about where it should be, but the B580 shows a relatively small gain here. I think there's driver work to be done in this game. Even at 1080p Ultra, it's still really close to the A770 and behind the 4060 and the 7600. At 1440p, very high settings, it does move barely ahead of AMD. Still not really running out of VRAM on the AMD cards because the 7600 is pretty much matched with the 7600 XT. And when you turn on upscaling, it's still just barely ahead of the AMD cards but behind the RTX 4060. So if this is what performance looked like everywhere, Arc B580 would not be that great. But I think this one, you can probably expect 10 to 20% higher performance with future drivers from Intel. It's just going to take a bit of time. Dragon Age the Veilguard, this one had a driver update during the launch window while press was reviewing the card and testing it. That fixed some problems. There were actually some other problems that it didn't fix, like if you install the current 6252 public drivers, I can't get Arc B580 to run. It won't compile the shaders. So you have to install preview drivers, 6249, compile those by running the game, and then install the newer drivers. And then Arc performs like this. Just barely behind AMD and Nvidia at 1080p medium, but it wins at 1080p Ultra by a little bit, and then the margin grows at 1440p Ultra, and with upscaling, it's still in the lead. This is a great Arc experience. XeSS is supported, so is FSR3 and DLSS. You can turn on FSR 3.1 frame generation as well, I believe. So a good win overall for Intel's new GPU. Final Fantasy XVI is the other end of the spectrum again. Arc B580 does not do well. AMD promoted this game, I believe, or at least it's a console port from the PlayStation 5 and it just runs better on AMD hardware. Whatever the case, it's not great on ARC. It's below the 4060 and the 7600 and the 7600 XT, only marginally ahead of the previous generation A770 and the, 4 years old, 3.5 years old, RTX 3060 12GB. Bump up to 1080p Ultra, and the 8GB cards as well as the 3060 start to struggle a bit more, but the 4060 is still faster than the ARC card, probably because drivers. ARC does pull ahead at 1440p Ultra relative to the 4060, but not by a huge margin, and the RX 7600 XT is still taking top spot. Turn on upscaling, and the RX 7600 XT and RTX 4060 both come out a bit ahead of ARC. Not a great experience though, as we're only getting like just over 32 frames per second average, with minimums way down on both NVIDIA and Intel GPUs. Flight Simulator 2024, I recently did the full deep dive into this. You can view that video here if you click that card. ARC does really well with the latest drivers. Beats everything by a fraction. I mean, it's not a big win, but it's a win. Bump up to 1080p Ultra and the 7600 XT pulls slightly ahead. And then back up 1440p Ultra, the B580 pulls slightly ahead. So if you're looking for a game that runs best on ARC at $250 compared to the $250 to $300 cards from AMD and NVIDIA, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 might just be that game. But upscaling does put the 7600 XT back in the lead, so keep that in mind. God of War Ragnarök. At 1080p medium, the RTX 4060 comes out as the winner. And look at the Arc B580. Those minimums are way down compared to a lot of the other cards, would suggest micro-stuttering, which is happening, so not a great experience. Ultra, basically the same story. I think this might be an NVIDIA promoted game, I'm not totally sure. When we get up to 1440p Ultra, ARC is still not able to catch the 4060. It's not running out of VRAM on NVIDIA's card with 8GB, and so it stays ahead. And that's true whether you're running native 1440p or with upscaling. It's not a bad result for ARC, but it needs more driver improvements, and that's also indicated by the relatively small gap between the B580 and the A770 16GB cards. I think this is another one where pre-release drivers had some bugs, and this still needs further tuning and driver improvements for the new Battlemage GPU. MechWarrior 5 Clans is an Unreal Engine 5 release, and it tends to be pretty heavy. At medium settings, AMD rises to the top just barely, though the 7600 vanilla card is having minimum FPS stuttering a little bit more than the 7600 XT. Once we get to 1080p maximum settings, we're pretty much tied with the 7600 XT on the B580, and everything else is a little bit slower. Then at 1440p, ARC B580 takes a clear lead, but it's not a huge lead. I mean, it's 3-4% faster than AMD's card, and maybe 10% faster than the RTX 4060. Turn on upscaling, and that gap narrows a little bit. So you're getting 50 frames per second with the ARC B580 compared to 47-48 frames per second on AMD and NVIDIA. Star Wars Outlaws. This uses Ubisoft's Snowdrop engine, so it's a little bit different look at maybe game engines and performance. ARC does pretty well, it seems, but it crashes all the time. So these results take them with a serious dosage of skepticism until Intel fixes the driver so that it's not frequently crashing on the Battlemage GPU. But it does get the win at all of our test settings right now. So whether you're at 1080p Ultra or 1440p Ultra or 1440p Ultra with upscaling, ARC B580 gets the win. And the 8GB cards, they do start to struggle, especially when you're playing for longer play sessions, not just running a benchmark. I would not want to play Star Wars Outlaws at Ultra settings with an 8GB card. Stalker 2 uses Unreal Engine 5 again, just like MechWarrior 5 Clans, and the results are a little different. I think this one just got a recent patch though, so I may need to go back and retest this in the future, see what's improved. It should be running better is my understanding, but I don't know if that universally impacts all GPUs or if it helps some GPUs more than others. We'll have to see. At 1080p medium, the B580 falls just behind AMD's cards and a little bit further behind the RTX 4060, but it beats the 3060. Hey, it's a 3.5-year-old card. It should beat it quite easily. At epic settings, the Arc still comes in third place behind the 7600 XT and the 4060, and those do cost about $300, so you're saving $50 potentially, but this is why Arc B580 at more than $250 isn't a good move. I don't know why people would even consider buying that. I think supply will improve in the future. We will wait and see. 1440p though, that's where the 8GB cards start to run out of memory. The RTX 4060 plummets down to sub 10 frames per second, so does the 7600. 8GB is not enough. In fact, even with upscaling, while the 8GB 4060 does better in my benchmark sequence, I think if you play the game for 10, 20, 30 minutes, hours at a time, you will have problems at these settings with the 4060 because of 8GB. I don't like 8GB cards these days, and I would not recommend spending more than about $200 on an 8GB GPU. There are better options. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. This was an AMD promoted game. Arc's average FPS looks quite good here, basically matching or beating the competition, but the minimum FPS is pretty bad. There's a lot of micro stutter happening throughout gameplay. It's pretty constant, so you're getting kind of a fast frame and a slow frame constantly fluctuating. And so even though the average FPS is pretty good, the minimum FPS does mar the experience. I mean, at 1080p Ultra, the minimum FPS is lower than any of the other tested GPUs. Maybe drivers will fix that. Hopefully drivers will fix that in the future. And at 1440p though, it's still the fastest card of the ones I tested. This is why Intel promoted 1440p gaming as an Arc B580 thing. It does better there than the competition. With upscaling though, not so much. DLSS is far more widely supported than XeSS or FSR 2 and 3. NVIDIA does have an advantage there and tends to look better. I would say DLSS looks best, XeSS second, FSR 2, 3 upscaling is third place, sometimes by a pretty wide margin. Also note that the 1440p with upscaling results are very close in almost all of the games to the 1080p Ultra native results. I probably won't test upscaling like this very often in the future just because it really is just a placeholder for 1080p native. Last game we have Witchfire, 1080p medium, and again, the B580 gets some serious micro stutter throughout, so that average FPS looks good, but minimum FPS is really quite poor. Hopefully that improves in the future. I think some of that might just be the early access nature of the game, but I have tested it in the past, and that video got enough views that I thought I would include this in my reviews going forward for at least a little while. We'll see. I want to aim for about 10 games tested for each of these GPU reviews. So that about wraps up the overall performance. With Witchfire, 1080p Ultra, Arc falls a little bit behind the 4060 still. 1440p Ultra, it pulls ahead because 8GB starts to be more of a problem, but this micro stutter is real, and that's probably the game more than anything that needs some TLC and work by the developers. And with upscaling, something to notice is Arc benefits the least from upscaling in Witchfire. I don't know if that's just the implementation or the early access nature, but it basically gets almost no benefit compared to like the 4060 got a pretty sizable benefit. The 4060 went from 70 FPS to 113 FPS. What is that, about a 50%, a little bit more than a 50% improvement? While the Arc B580 went from 76 frames per second at 1440p native to just 94 frames per second with upscaling. AMD also got a bigger benefit, so B580 falls to the bottom of the charts. That's probably the XeSS implementation, I can't say for sure. The other thing I do want to look at before signing off here is power. Arc B580 has a nominal total graphics power or total board power of 190 watts. It is not hitting that at all. I mean, I averaged 143 watts across all the games at 1080p medium, 147 at 1080p ultra, 156 at 1440p ultra, and then that drops back down to 148 with upscaling at 1440p ultra. So well under the 190 watt limit, but still about 30-ish watts more than NVIDIA's RTX 4060, but also 50 watts, 60 watts less than the previous generation Arc A770. So that's a good improvement for Intel, not enough to get the outright lead for efficiency, but it's definitely a move in the right direction. Also note that AMD's RX 7600 XT and 7600, while they do generally use more power especially the 7600 XT. It's also built on an older TSMC 6nm N6 node compared to N5 on the B580, so it should use more power is what I'm saying. Basically, Intel has closed the gap, but it hasn't caught up to NVIDIA. That's my key takeaway, I think, for this review. Clock speeds 2850 MHz is the limit for the Arc B580 at stock settings. Even on these factory overclock cards like the Steel Legend OC from ASRock, their graphics clock that they advertise with, it's higher than the 2670 MHz of the default model B580 cards from like Intel. But the boost clock limit of 2850 isn't changed, and so everything basically hits 2850 MHz across almost every game. I mean, I averaged just 1 or 2 megahertz below that across 10 games, across 4 settings. Clock speed is the limiting factor here, not power. I think overclocking could probably get a fairly sizable, maybe even up to 20% boost on the Arc B580, but then at the same time, that could also reduce your lifespan. I don't want to encourage people to go overclocking if they don't know what they're getting into. Temperatures on Arc B580 are good with this ASRock card. It ties the 4060 or beats it at every setting. That's good to see. It's not running hot. It runs cool and quiet. Great. Is it worth the $20 extra? That really depends on how much you like RGB lighting. If you love it, yes. If you don't like RGB lighting, you should just get the base model Arc limited edition from Intel, assuming you can find one in stock, because it will perform just as well as the factory overclocked ASRock Steel Legend. That's it. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think. I tried to keep this a little shorter, but there's a lot to cover with the new graphics card, and I haven't done any graphics cards reviews prior to this because I've only just gotten started on this channel in the last few months, and there weren't any new cards to review. So I had to do a bunch of testing so that I'm really looking at apples to apples. Latest drivers were installed. Intel's 2652 public drivers for the ASRock card. NVIDIA is using 566.36 without the NVIDIA app overlay enabled. That can hurt performance, I've heard elsewhere. And AMD is using the 24.12.1 drivers. The rest of the components are listed in the description. Core i9-13900K, that's plenty fast. The 14900K is just slightly faster, like 3% or less. 9800X3D might be a bigger lead in some situations and less in others, because that's kind of how it goes with that stacked X3D cache on AMD's chips. And we're almost never hitting CPU bottlenecks with the Arc B580 or any of these other mid-range cards that I've used for benchmarking, so I sincerely doubt that you would see higher performance with a 9800 X3D if you could find one of those in stock either. But let me know what you think with this slightly shorter, less detailed dive into the card and the architecture and all that stuff. Let me know if you want the longer video. I'm going to make that and release that, so leave a comment there if you prefer that. Let me know which presentation mode you prefer. Like, share, and subscribe. Please really do subscribe and share, because that will help my channel grow. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Have a great holiday season, and we will see you next time.